She stayed quiet, healed in silence, and now her absence screams louder than her love ever did. You gave your heart fully, and he took it like it was nothing. He thought you'd stay broken, thought you'd keep chasing, but the silence you gave him, that silence became your power. This isn't about revenge. This is about becoming the woman he'll never touch again, the one he regrets losing every single day. This is your rise, your fire, your story, and it starts right now. You gave love with open hands. Now your silence is louder than your pain. They thought your kindness was a weakness. They mistook your warmth for something that could be toyed with. You didn't come into this world guarded. You weren't born cold. You loved with your entire soul, wide open, believing that being soft was a strength. And it was, until it became the very thing that shattered you. You didn't ask for much, just honesty, loyalty, respect, but somehow that was too much for people who only knew how to take, and still you stayed. You gave more, you forgave the lies, you overlooked the silence, you excused the neglect, you watered a connection that was already dying, hoping somehow your consistency could bring it back to life. But it never did it? Because some people aren't moved by effort. Some people don't notice loyalty until it's gone, and the worst part, you saw the red flags, you felt the distance growing, you knew something wasn't right. But you held on, not because you were blind, but because you believed in what you gave. That's what hurt the most, not that you were lied to, but that you kept loving in spite of it. You reached a point where your heart couldn't carry the weight anymore. You didn't explode, you didn't lash out, you just stopped, quietly, calmly, completely, and that silence, that was the shift. That was when everything changed, because the version of you they had gotten used to, always reaching out, always forgiving, always available, was gone. You didn't leave to teach a lesson. You left because your spirit couldn't afford to stay, and now your silence is louder than anything you ever said. It echoes, it haunts, it creates a void. People remember noise, but they feel absence. And the absence of someone who gave everything, that hits different. When you stop chasing, stop explaining, stop pleading, they start listening, but by then it's too late, because the version of you they hurt doesn't exist anymore. You didn't disappear to prove a point. You disappeared because you outgrew the version of yourself that tolerated being treated like an option. They wanted the attention, you gave presence. They wanted the thrill. You gave depth. And now they scroll through memories trying to recreate something they'll never touch again. Because the cold you, the distant you, that's not revenge, that's evolution. And no one warned them that your silence would become the loudest thing they'd ever hear. See, when a heart like yours goes quiet, it's not out of pride, it's out of survival. You stopped explaining your worth because worth doesn't beg, it doesn't chase, it simply walks away when it's no longer seen. And that walk away moment, that was your rebirth. That was the moment you chose peace over chaos. You stopped waiting for change and became the change. You stopped asking to be chosen and chose yourself. Now they see you from a distance, unreachable, unbothered, untouchable, and maybe they whisper to others about how you changed. Maybe they wonder if you still think about them. Maybe they check your page, hoping to find signs of weakness, some proof that you miss them. But you're not the same. You're not pretending to be cold. You've just healed beyond the version of yourself that accepted breadcrumbs. You're no longer performing pain in public. You're mastering peace in private. And that's the irony. They expected you to break. They expected you to come crawling back. But instead you vanished, not with bitterness, but with grace, not with rage, but with silence, and that silence. That's your new language, that's your power now, because nothing shakes a person more than realizing the one they thought would never leave already has. You gave love with open hands, and they didn't know how rare that was. Now they sit with the memory of a version of you they'll never access again. You didn't turn cold, you just stopped pouring into places that couldn't hold you. You stopped explaining your worth, because real value doesn't beg to be seen. There was a time when you used to try to be understood, try to be appreciated, try to make someone see the depth of who you were. You'd stretch yourself to prove your intentions, to show you meant well. You thought if you just loved harder, stayed longer, forgave more, they would finally see it, finally understand what they had in you, but they didn't, and not because you weren't worthy, but because they weren't capable of recognizing it. You spent so much energy explaining things you should never have had to explain, explaining your silence, explaining your needs, explaining your heart. You kept hoping that one day they'd wake up and say, "I see you now, I finally get it," but that day never came. And somewhere along the way you realized people don't value what they don't understand, and they don't understand what they're not ready to meet. You were talking to someone who didn't have the capacity to hear you. You were offering soul-level truth to someone who only knew how to skim the surface, and still you tried, because that's what people with pure intentions do. They try, they believe, they fight. But even the strongest heart gets tired. Tired of repeating itself, tired of proving its innocence, tired of trying to make someone see value where love already existed in its purest form. Then one day the trying stopped, not because you stopped caring, but because you started caring about yourself more. You finally asked the question, why am I explaining what should already be seen? Why am I convincing someone to recognize something that should have been undeniable from the start? That's when the shift happened. You stopped speaking in circles. You stopped pouring into deaf ears. You stopped offering explanations to someone who had no intention of understanding. And in that silence you found something stronger than validation. You found self-respect. You stopped needing to be seen because you saw yourself. That's what they never tell you about healing. It doesn't come wrapped in rage. It doesn't look like fire and fury. Sometimes it's just quiet. Sometimes healing looks like letting the phone ring, leaving the message on read, walking away without a monologue, because when you know your value, you no longer try to convince anyone of it. You become it. You embody it. You walk into a room and your presence speaks before you do. They say silence is powerful, but your silence, it's transformational because it isn't rooted in bitterness, it's rooted in clarity. You're not withholding words out of spite. You're withholding them because not everyone deserves access to your energy, especially not those who made you feel like you had to earn your own worth. Let that sink in. You used to beg to be heard by people who couldn't even hear themselves. You used to explain your emotions to someone who couldn't even name their own. That wasn't love. That was survival. That was you trying to hold something together that was never meant to be carried alone. But you don't live there anymore. You don't belong to that version of yourself who stayed up at night wondering what more you could have done. That version of you is gone, and in its place, a quieter, stronger, clearer you. One who doesn't seek to be understood by those who never tried. One who doesn't perform for love. One who understands that real value doesn't announce itself. It just is, and now your silence speaks. Louder than any explanation ever could, it tells the world, I know who I am, I know what I bring, and I no longer need your recognition to validate it. You're not proving anything anymore. You've proven it enough. To yourself, and that's all that matters, so let them wonder why you stopped reaching out. Let them question your sudden calm. Let them replay your words in their head, trying to make sense of what changed. You don't owe them closure, you don't owe them clarity, you owe yourself peace, and that peace comes from no longer needing to be seen. Because you've finally seen yourself, they laughed when you stayed soft, now they cry when you went cold. You used to think love was enough, that if you just stayed soft, stayed open, stayed kind, things would eventually shift. You believed in patience, in effort, in the slow build of trust, so you kept showing up, even when the energy wasn't matched. You stayed gentle in a world that kept trying to harden you, and they saw that softness and thought it meant you'd never walk away. They thought your heart was a weakness, that your forgiveness made you easy, that your empathy made you blind. They didn't understand what it cost you to stay soft in the face of repeated disappointment. Every time you stayed silent instead of snapping, every time you chose grace instead of retaliation, it wasn't because you didn't feel the hurt. It was because you had the strength to rise above it, but they didn't see it like that. They laughed quietly, mocked your consistency, played games with your loyalty, confused your emotional openness for naivety. And you knew, deep down you felt it, the disrespect, the quiet disregard, the moments where your presence was taken for granted, but you stayed not because you didn't know your worth, but because you were hoping they'd grow into someone who did. You thought maybe, just maybe, they'd wake up to the rare love they were being handed without having to earn it. They didn't, and over time something shifted inside you, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in clarity. You started to see things for what they were, not what you wanted them to be. You started noticing how light you had to become just to keep their world from breaking, how heavy you became carrying emotions that weren't yours to hold, how you were the only one showing up with real hands while they came with empty ones. That's when the softness started to fade, not out of hate but out of exhaustion. One day you just stopped offering explanations. Stopped justifying your love, stopped giving them the privilege of access, not with yelling, not with theatrics, just silence, just absence, just distance, and that silence, that's what changed everything. Because for the first time they felt what life was like without your warmth, without your softness, without the version of you that always showed up even after being let down, and now they cry, not because you shouted, not because you exploded, but because you finally did the one thing they never expected. You left, and you left cold, detached, silent, without the softness that once made them feel invincible. You see, that's the thing about hearts like yours. You don't break loudly, you don't cause scenes, you just slowly detach until one day you're no longer reachable, and once you go cold, there's no switch to flip you back. Now they scroll through memories that don't smile back. They stare at a version of you they once had free access to, and they realize your softness was never a weakness. It was a privilege, one they thought would never expire. They miss the you that cared too much. The you that tried too hard, the you that stayed long after you should have walked, but that you doesn't exist anymore because you finally understood that being soft in the wrong hands is just self-destruction dressed as love. So you became cold, not bitter but wiser, not vengeful, just unavailable. You didn't harden your heart, you just learned who was no longer worthy of its warmth, and now your distance burns in a way your presence never could. Because the absence of someone real is louder than the presence of someone fake. Let them sit with the silence, let them sit with the weight of what they lost. You don't have to explain, you don't have to perform. You don't even have to forgive, just keep walking with your peace, with your dignity, with the quiet strength of someone who no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. They laughed when you stayed soft, now they cry when you went cold. You walked away without fire or noise, just quiet power and unshakable peace. They expected you to break things on your way out, to raise your voice, throw accusations, demand closure. That's what people expect from someone who's been pushed too far. But you didn't give them the satisfaction. You didn't give them chaos. You gave them silence. You gave them calm, and that calm, that was louder than anything you could have screamed. You see, walking away isn't always about anger. Sometimes it's about clarity. You reached a point where you didn't need to prove your pain anymore. You didn't need them to feel it, didn't need to hear an apology, didn't need to explain one more time why you felt unseen, unheard, or unchosen. You were done trying to get them to care, you were done hoping they'd finally understand, so you let go, not because you stopped loving, but because you started loving yourself more, and that shift, that internal change. That's what made your exit so powerful. No fireworks, no storm. Just the sound of your own footsteps as you chose peace over being constantly misunderstood. They didn't see it coming, because they were used to the version of you that held on. The one that always reached out, always tried to fix things, always gave second, third, fourth chances. They believed that as long as they gave you just enough to keep you hopeful, you'd never leave. They were wrong, because the truth is, you didn't leave in a moment of rage. You left in a moment of realization, a quiet moment, the kind that only happens when your soul gets tired of shrinking just to be loved. When you finally understand that the version of you that keeps begging to be seen isn't you at all, it's a survival mode you've outgrown, so you walked away, not to punish them, not to get attention, but to heal. To breathe, to reclaim the parts of yourself that got lost trying to be enough for someone who never valued enough in the first place. They'll replay it in their mind over and over, wondering when you decided to stop trying. But the truth is, it didn't happen all at once. It was every unanswered question, every silent treatment, every moment you felt like a placeholder instead of a priority, every time you had to wonder where you stood. It was quiet death by 1,000 cuts, and when you finally stood up, it wasn't out of anger, it was out of clarity. You weren't looking to be dramatic. You weren't hoping they'd chase you. You didn't walk out with a grand announcement. You didn't need to, because peace doesn't announce itself, it just replaces chaos, and when you finally found it, you realized how heavy everything else had been, how much noise you'd been living in. How much energy you wasted trying to earn what should have been freely given. Now they sit in the aftermath, not of your rage but of your absence, and that absence, it's loud, it lingers, because no one expects the kind soul to vanish. No one expects the loyal heart to walk, but when it does, when that person finally chooses themselves, everything changes, the balance shifts, the silence becomes a mirror, and they look into that mirror and see what they lost. Not because you tried to show them, but because you stopped trying entirely. That's the power of peace. It doesn't argue. It doesn't defend itself. It just leaves, and leaves everything unsettled in its wake. You didn't need revenge. You didn't need validation. You didn't need an audience to understand why you left. You just needed truth, your truth. And once you had that, you couldn't stay one more second in a space that dimmed it. So no, you didn't burn the bridge. You just stopped walking across it. You didn't slam the door. You just stopped knocking, and that quiet, that stillness, that's your power now. You walked away without fire or noise, just quiet power and unshakable peace. You built yourself in the dark and came back untouchable. No one saw the nights you broke in silence. No one witnessed the way your chest caved in from the weight of betrayal. You weren't posting about the pain. You weren't screaming for attention. You just disappeared, quietly, not to punish anyone but to survive. You withdrew into your own world, a world that no one was invited into, not because you hated them, but because you needed to find yourself in the ruins they left behind. In that darkness you weren't weak, you were real, you were raw, you were wrecked, yes, but that's where the rebuilding began. That's where the old version of you started to die, the version that tolerated mistreatment. The version that believed love meant sacrifice at any cost. The version that made excuses for other people's disregard. That version didn't survive the silence, and that's exactly how it had to be, because something happens when the noise stops. When the distractions fall away, when there's no one left to lie to you except your own reflection, in that stillness you heard the truth, and it wasn't pretty, it wasn't soothing, it was brutal. You had to admit what you allowed. You had to face the parts of yourself that accepted being overlooked, used, forgotten. That kind of self-confrontation doesn't come with applause. It comes with tears, with shaking hands, with nights you can't breathe. But you stayed in it. You didn't run from the process. You let it tear you apart so you could rebuild without the parts of you that settled for less than love. You didn't post quotes about it. You didn't throw hints. You just got quiet, got still, and started the work. Day by day, brick by brick, you rebuilt a foundation that didn't rely on anyone else's validation. You started to love the parts of yourself they never noticed. You started to protect your peace like it was the most expensive thing you owned. You started seeing your softness as sacred, not something to give away to people who only knew how to take, and slowly you changed. Not on the outside, on the inside, you became still, focused, sharper, not colder but clearer. You stopped seeking permission to be whole. You stopped asking for love that had to be begged for. You stopped giving away energy to people who couldn't even hold space for your presence. You learned that healing doesn't always look like joy. Sometimes it looks like boundaries, like saying less, like outgrowing conversations, like walking past what used to break you without flinching. Now they look at you and say you've changed. They say you've gone distant, closed off. But what they're really seeing is the version of you they never expected to meet. The version you forged in fire. The version you had to find when no one was clapping for you. This version doesn't explain itself. It doesn't chase. It doesn't lower its standards to be understood. This version is rooted. It's solid. It's untouchable, not because it's above anyone, but because it knows exactly what it is. You didn't build yourself in the spotlight. You weren't healed by praise. You didn't get stronger by being seen. You got stronger in solitude, in quiet pain, in deep, uncomfortable reflection, and that kind of strength, it can't be faked. It doesn't come from performance. It comes from pain that didn't destroy you because you refused to let it define you. They don't know the nights you cried yourself to sleep. They don't know the weight you carried alone. They just see the outcome, the calm, the presence, the clarity, and now they can't touch you, not because you're hiding, but because you've grown too far beyond where they left you. You built yourself in the dark and came back untouchable. You don't seek revenge. You became it. You didn't waste your time plotting how to get even. You didn't sit around thinking about what you'd say if you ever saw them again. You didn't need to burn bridges or shout your pain just to make a point. That was never your way, because deep down you knew real revenge isn't about what you say or do to them. It's about who you become without them. They expected anger, they expected chaos, they expected you to fall apart and make a scene, but what they got instead was distance, evolution, silence, and nothing stings more than the absence of the person they once underestimated. You didn't become colder, just clearer. You didn't become cruel, just unavailable. You didn't take revenge into your hands. You let your transformation speak for itself. That's what they never understand. People think revenge is loud, but your revenge was the discipline to heal, the self-control to stay quiet while your life started speaking louder than your pain. You didn't scream, you didn't chase, you didn't throw back what they threw at you. You just moved differently. You stopped giving access. You stopped showing up where your presence was never honored. You became a mirror, not a weapon. And when they finally looked into that mirror, they saw everything they gave up reflected in what you became. You weren't trying to hurt anyone. That's not how your heart operates. But you did become a version of yourself that could no longer be hurt in the same way. That's what they never prepared for. They thought breaking you would keep you broken. They thought walking away would make you beg. They thought they could play with your loyalty forever. But you walked away and didn't look back. You outgrew the wounds. You outgrew the patterns. You outgrew the need to be understood by someone who was never built to hold your depth. That's the kind of revenge that doesn't come with noise. It comes with results. It comes with glow, with growth, with grace. You started showing up in rooms with power in your posture. You started setting boundaries with no hesitation. You started saying no to the same situations that once tempted you back into cycles. And people noticed, not just them, everyone, because when you heal right, it's not just visible, it's undeniable. Your peace became your weapon. Your success became your message. Your silence became the loudest response. You didn't have to attack them. Life handled that. Life always makes people face the cost of what they mishandled. You didn't seek revenge because you understood something deeper. Hurting them wouldn't heal you. But healing you, that would haunt them forever. Because when someone tries to break you and fails, they have to live with the fact that they only built a stronger version of you. Now they scroll through your life from the outside. Now they replay your words in their head, trying to remember when you stopped being theirs, but that version of you, the soft, forgiving, overextending version, they buried it, they didn't cherish it when they had it. And you let it die with your silence. What came after, that was earned, not given. You built that version alone, in the quiet, in the pain, in the long, hard nights when no one clapped for you, but you still got up anyway. You don't tell your story to get sympathy. You tell it to remind yourself of how far you've come. The real revenge was waking up and realizing you didn't need them to win. The real revenge was knowing you could have turned bitter, but you chose to build. You chose discipline, you chose peace, you chose elevation. That's the thing about people who think they can break you. They never imagine what happens when you rebuild in silence. They never expect to see you again, not like this. Not untouchable, not elevated, not glowing with a calm that only comes from surviving what was meant to destroy you. So no, you don't seek revenge. You don't need it. You became it. You don't have to prove your pain anymore. You don't have to explain why you changed, why you walked, or why your silence grew louder than your love. You stayed soft in a world that tried to harden you. You gave more than anyone ever saw. And when it was finally time to let go, you didn't break things. You broke patterns. They thought you'd come back. They thought the same old game would work. But what they didn't know was that the version of you they played with doesn't exist anymore. The woman who once gave everything, she died in the silence, and what came back was someone untouchable, someone built in the dark, someone who doesn't chase, doesn't beg, doesn't explain. You didn't become bitter, you became better. You didn't seek revenge, you became it, and now he regrets it every single day, not because you punished him, but because you healed so far beyond his reach. So this is goodbye, not the kind with tears or explanations, the kind with peace, with power, the kind that doesn't need to be heard, because it's already felt. You're not the same anymore, and that's the part they'll never forget.